I hope you enjoyed your orientation week because now we're really going to get down to business. And I realize we already covered a lot in that orientation lesson, and we kind of got a basic feel for Illustrator and how it works, some of the basic shape building tools, but now we're going to take the next step and really start to focus on how to make completely custom graphics. So I'm going to start by making a new document. Just come into Illustrator, create new, and I'm going to make a 1920 by 1080, which remember is under the Web tab, and then Web Large, 1920 by 1080 pixels preset. Click Create. And like I said, we already know how to use the basic shape building tools and even how to make some simple art using those basic shapes. But now we need to focus on one tool in particular, and that's this one right here, the pen tool. And the reason why the pen tool is so important is because it allows us to make completely custom paths inside of Illustrator. And not only that, the pen tool shows up in Illustrator, Photoshop, After Effects, and even more Adobe software that you might be running into down the line. So it's really important to have a good understanding of how to use it and how to get it to do exactly what you want it to so that you have no trouble making the graphics that you have in your head on the screen. And before I even start using it, I just want to address the name. It's called the pen tool, but it does not behave anything like a real pen. You think of a pen in your hand, you're putting it on paper and drawing lines around. That's not at all how we're going to use this tool, but that is pretty much the universal name for this tool across all applications. So just know the pen tool does not behave like an actual pen. Instead, the way that it works is by clicking and adding points wherever you click. So if I click once here on my canvas, I've got a little square representing the anchor point, and then I have this blue line coming off of it. That's a guide line. It's just letting me know what my line is going to look like wherever I have my mouse hovering for where the next point is going to be. So if I put my mouse down here, I can see this is where the line is going to go. If I click one more time, there we go. Now I have a line between those 2 points. I can move my mouse again. We've got this guideline coming off one more time, letting me know what the path is going to look like if I click over here. So I'll click one more time. And now I have 3 points. Now I want to close this path off by coming over to the original anchor point that I drew just by clicking, and this little circle in the bottom right corner shows up of my little pen icon. That's letting me know that if I click, it's going to close the path. So I'll click one more time, and now I have a completed custom object closed path. And if I disable my white background here by going up to View and coming down to Show Transparency Grid, remember that shows us what is actually in our document. If there's transparency, we have this checkerboard showing through to let us know there's nothing actually there. We can see that this shape, this closed path that I made with these 3 points, has a white fill and a black stroke. Just like over here, it's showing me white fill, black stroke. Alright, I'm going to turn that transparency grid back off. And then let's just change the color so we can see this a little bit easier. I'll make it like a nice bluey color, something like that. And then I'll get rid of my little color panel. Now I want to talk a little bit about what these points actually are and how Illustrator is actually generating these graphics, because it's an important concept to understand. Illustrator is a vector-based program, and this path that I just drew is a vector graphic made up of vector paths. Now, a vector path is mathematically calculated. I'm giving Illustrator the data of these points. So right there, you can see this little pop-up in the gray box. It says where the X and Y position of that point are in relationship to the document. So Illustrator saying this is where point 1 is, down here this is where point 2 goes, down here this is where point 3 goes, and then Illustrator is connecting those dots using math and then filling the area with it. And it's also giving us this stroke, the black stroke around it. I'll make it a little bit bigger so we can see it. And styling those vector paths. So it's literally mathematical. It is being completely calculated by the computer and generating this art on the screen for me. What's really great about these vector graphics is that because they're mathematically calculated, I could scale this up as far as I want. So I'll switch to my selection tool, grab this little corner, hold Shift and Option to scale from the center. I could scale it up as much as I want, and I'm not going to lose any quality. I'll zoom in nice and close here. You can see these super clean lines. It's never going to lose any kind of quality, no matter how much I scale it up or down. I can always maintain that same clean lines because all of those points are being calculated mathematically. Now, that might seem like a no-brainer, but it's going to be very apparent that that's a unique thing to Illustrator and vector graphics once we move into Photoshop, which is a raster-based program. But don't get caught up in that. Don't think too much on that. We'll get to that very soon. For now, let's just focus on how these paths are actually working. Currently, this path that I drew is made up of these 3 points, and they're all connected by straight lines. It's just straight shot from this point to this point, back to this point, and that point. But these lines don't have to be straight. You can actually curve these lines and influence the curve based on the points that we drew. So let me go ahead and delete this shape and show you what I mean. I'll go back to my pen tool. The keyboard shortcut for the pen tool is P in Illustrator, so that's an easy one to remember, P for the pen tool. And I'll start drawing another line. So I'll click, but instead of letting go this time, I'm going to drag before I let go of my mouse. And you'll notice this is giving me these 2 little lines with circles on the end of them coming off of that middle point where I clicked. So I'll just drag it out to about here and let go. Now you see my guide is no longer just a straight line. It's got this curve to it. So I'll go over here and maybe click and drag again. And you can see how that is influencing the curvature between those 2 points. So I'll do something maybe like this and let go. And then I'll come down here and drag, click and drag to get a shape like that. And then maybe one up here, click and drag. And this is not going to be a pretty shape, but I'm just kind of showing you how this entire system works. I'll do another one down here, click and drag. One up here, click and drag. And then finally, come back to my original anchor point, click, and then drag to curve out that last point. So maybe I'll do something like that. Alright, so now I have a very unique, pretty ugly looking shape, but it's something that's completely custom. I wouldn't have been able to make this really from using these basic shape tools over here. And even though this doesn't look all that great, you can really use the pen tool to make any type of shape that you want. So I'm going to select this object with the direct selection tool. And when I do that, it's going to show me all of these handles. Let me change this blue color so it's easier to see these lines. I'll just change it to something nice and green. That's really ugly. Let's make it nicer to look at. And I'll turn off the stroke for now. So this shape is made up of all these different points that I made, but then I've influenced the connection between those points using curves. And all of these lines with the dots on the ends that are coming off are called handles, and more specifically Bezier handles. These vector paths are named after the person who invented them. It's called Bezier paths. That was his last name, and that is the whole foundation of how vector graphics work. These handles allow me to change the curvature between points. So with my direct selection tool, which remember the keyboard shortcut is A for that tool, I could come over to this handle right here, this dot, just click and drag and start manipulating this curve. And as I'm doing this, you can see that it's not only manipulating this side of the curve, but it's also moving this handle at the same time. So the angle of this line, these 2 handles together, are linked so that when I move it around, the angle is always going to be symmetrical. Now I can bring this in and make that curve a little less exaggerated there, and it's not going to bring this one in. So I can adjust the distance of these handles from their parent anchor point independently of each other, but the angle is going to stay the same. But if I come over to the pen tool and hold down on it, I have a few more tools that I can access here. The last one is the next one I want to talk about. This is the anchor point tool. I've got these 2 little lines. I'll just select that. And what this tool allows you to do is grab a handle and disconnect it basically from being symmetrical with the other handle on that anchor point. I'll come back to that tool and just adjust this again. So you can see that now I can actually independently adjust these 2 curves, these 2 handles, so that I don't have a smooth curve here anymore. Instead, I have this little dip. I could do this with any of these handles. So I can make this shape look completely different. So there we go. We've got something that looks a little bit different now. Another thing that this tool can do is reset the handles. So if I have this selected and I say I want to have these two handles be symmetrical again, I can, instead of grabbing a handle, click and drag on the anchor point to reset these handles. And now you see that they're coming out symmetrically. And then I can switch back to my direct selection tool and move them around again. I can also remove the handles completely from an anchor point with that tool just by clicking once on the anchor. So I could get rid of all the curves in here if I wanted to, and then I'm just going to have these straight lines again going on these points. There's the same number of points, they're all in the same place, but the Bezier handles are gone. If I want to put them back in, I can just start clicking and dragging again, and you'll notice that as I pull this, I can actually kind of reverse the direction of these curves. Now with the fill, that doesn't look all that great, but if I were to swap the fill and the stroke and deselect, I'll make this a little bit thicker so it's easier to see, and that light green's probably kind of hard to see, so let's just make it a little bit more vibrant. There we go. You can see that's kind of like a loop-de-loop, and I could take that tool again and maybe smooth this out to make it look a little nicer. But there are some possibilities where crossing paths like that actually does look pretty good. Alright, I'm going to put that fill back on and then again make this a different color, something that's a little bit easier on the eyes. There we go, that might be a little easier to look at. And then I'll just reverse these handles one more time and then introduce the handles back on all of these other points. So there we go, we've got a nice curvy shape again. So the pen tool allows you to draw these curvy paths or just click once to add paths that don't have any curvature. And then the direct selection tool allows you to manipulate those handles symmetrically. It allows you to manipulate these points to adjust the shape of the path. And then the anchor point tool allows you to manipulate these handles a little bit more custom, where you can break the relationship between the two handles so they're no longer symmetrical, or you can introduce handles or reset the handles. Now with the anchor point tool and the direct selection tool, if I were to grab one of these handles and bring it back to the anchor point, see it snaps there and I get this little square icon, and then my mouse cursor is actually turned to a white arrow. That's letting me know that if I let go, it's going to remove the handle completely. So there's only one Bezier handle coming off of this path. And I could do the same thing with my direct selection tool. If I grab this one and bring it down to here and let go, now the connection point between these two anchor points is going to be straight, but there's going to be a curve coming off of the outside of each one of them. So between the pen tool, the anchor point tool, and the direct selection tool, you can really customize the way that your paths look. But here's a little workflow tip. You can actually access both the direct selection tool and the anchor point tool from within the pen tool just by using keyboard modifiers. So if I hold down Option or Alt on a PC, my cursor turns to that anchor point tool. So this is going to temporarily allow me to use the anchor point tool without actually having to switch to it. So I'll just hold down Option and then I can modify this handle. Maybe I want curvature on both sides of these handles again, anchor points rather, again. So I could do that. And then if I want to manipulate the position of these anchor points, all I have to do is hold down Command or Control on a PC, and then I'm temporarily activating the direct selection tool. So I can quickly move some anchor points around, reposition stuff to the way that I like it, maybe manipulate these handles a little bit, and then let go and I'm back to my pen tool. Another great thing about the pen tool, if I hold down on the pen tool, we see that we have an add anchor point tool and a delete anchor point tool. I actually don't even need to switch over to those, because if I just hover over any point on this path, you see that I get that little plus icon next to the pen tool icon, and that's going to let me know that if I click, it will add in another point. And if I hover over a different point, say this one, I get a minus, letting me know that if I click, that's going to get rid of that point. So that's why I say I don't even need to switch to those tools, because even without a modifier key, all I have to do is hover over those anchor points or paths, and it will automatically switch to that proper tool. Another great thing to know is that with the direct selection tool, either temporarily activated or just selected, if I hover over a path, and remember a path is the connection between two anchor points, if I hover over that, I get this little arc with 2 points on it. This is letting me know that if I click and drag, I can manipulate that curve kind of just by pushing and pulling. So I can just kind of free form change the way that these curves look. Now this is not very precise, but it is another way to be able to modify your paths, so be aware of that. Now obviously all I've made so far is a couple of blobs. This is not very pretty to look at. And this is where I want to bring up an important point. 9 times out of 10, my workflow, and I would assume most designers' workflow, is to not just design something freehand with the pen tool. Most of the time, I'm using an image or a photo or some kind of a sketch as reference, because drawing with the pen tool is not very intuitive. It's not like drawing with an actual pen or a pencil. Clicking and adding points, dragging out these handles and manipulating curves, it's not that intuitive, and your brain just typically doesn't think in that way of creating art. So that's why I say we use a photo or a sketch most of the time for a reference. Unless I'm trying to make something abstract, like these shapes. Maybe I'm just trying to have kind of a fun abstract background. Maybe these kind of shapes that I'm just freehand drawing and manipulating these handles is going to work. But right now what I want to show you is how I would use the pen tool to trace something like a photograph. So that's what I'm going to use right now. You can bring photos into Illustrator for reference. To do that, you're going to want to come up to File, and then down to Place. So I'll click on that. And then on my desktop, I have this photo of a pair of sunglasses. I'll come down and click on Place, and then Illustrator wants me to click on the document where I want the photo. And this is going to be placing the top left corner of the image. So I'm just going to come to the top left corner of my canvas, and there we go. This photo is now inside of Illustrator, and I can click and drag it to reposition it. I'll just center it up, horizontally align the center, vertically align the center. Again, if you're not seeing this menu up here, remember, just come up to Window, Control. And now this image is existing in my document. But this actually has a white background to it. If I come up to View, say Show Transparency Grid, this is the bounds of my image, and you see the background is actually white. There's no transparency in this image. It's not really important, but I just thought you should know this is an actual photograph, not a graphic being generated by Illustrator. I'll turn that transparency grid back off, and then I'll come over to my layers and rename this one Photo Ref for reference. I'll lock that layer and make a new one. Alright, so this is where I'm going to draw my paths. I'll zoom in nice and close. Remember, Z is the shortcut for the zoom tool, and then I'm just scrubbing left or right to zoom in and out. And these sunglasses are actually going to serve as a really good example of where you should be placing your points and how to make really, really nice looking curves. So I want to point out something about the sunglasses. First of all, it's a mirrored image, right? There are 2 lenses to the glasses. This half is exactly the same as this half, it's just mirrored. And I want this graphic to be very nice and clean. I want to make it as perfect as possible. So what I'm going to do is trace half of the sunglasses and then duplicate that half, mirror it, and then connect them together. And that way I'll know that each half is exactly the same, just mirrored. Let's start with the lens of the sunglasses. I'll switch over to my pen tool, P on the keyboard, and then I'm going to swap my fill and stroke so that my stroke is this nice bright yellow. Just easy to look at and identify. We can modify the colors later. And I want to point out that I have my smart guides turned on right now, so this is actually snapping to the center of the image and the bounds of the image. I don't want that happening, so I'm going to disable it. And it's really important that you know the keyboard shortcut for smart guides, because a lot of times you're going to want to be turning it on and off depending on if it's snapping to something you want or don't want. So Command or Control plus U disables it. There we go. Okay, so one thing that you're probably going to run into when you start using the pen tool for the first time is adding a whole lot of points to make up some pretty simple shapes. A lot more than you'll probably need to. So let me show you what I mean by that. If you tackle this lens over here, you might start by drawing a path like this, and then maybe coming over here and doing one right here, making sure that curve fits nicely, and then probably one in the corner here, and then down here, and maybe one in the bottom middle, and then over here in this corner, one probably should go right about here, and then one in this corner, and then click one more time to finish that off. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with adding that many points. If I switch to my outline view, coming up to View, outline or Command or Control Y. This is going to get rid of the image, get rid of the colors, and just show me my paths. This looks like a pretty good drawing of that lens, and it would potentially be acceptable. It might need a little bit of work down in this corner. It looks a little bit not quite as smooth as the actual lens, but for a first run through, that's not bad at all. I'll turn my outline mode back off. But there's actually a key to making really nice looking curves, and that is to keep as few points as possible in your paths. Generally, fewer points are going to equal nicer looking curves and much better looking graphics. And I realize you're probably thinking that's great, but how do you do this with fewer points, and where do you even know where to put these points? Well, here's another little hint. Generally, on shapes like this that have curves, you're going to want to look for the widest points and the tallest points of the shape, and that's where you're going to want to put your points. So up here on this curve, this is what I mean by the highest point. Right about there is where it looks like the lens is at its highest. So I'll switch to the pen tool, P on the keyboard, and that's where I'm going to place my first point. I'll click and drag. And right now, this is kind of just freehand. The angles of the handles are kind of just going wherever I put my mouse. But if I hold down that modifier key Shift that's used for so many things, it will snap those handles to being just horizontal, just vertical, or at one of the 45-degree angles. This is another extremely important thing to understand. Keeping your handles at horizontal or vertical positions will produce very nice looking curves. So I'm going to try to do as much of this with horizontal or vertical as I possibly can. So I'm going to stretch this out to about here. There's not really a good way of knowing how far out you should pull your handles on the first point, but as you do this more, you'll kind of get a feel for it and be able to predict how these curves are going to look even on the first point. So I pulled my handles out about that far. And then I want to look for the next extreme, the widest point on the curve of this lens. It looks like the curve is coming out, 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 and right about there is where it stops going out to the right and starts curving back into the left. So somewhere right about there, I'll click, hold down Shift while dragging, and make this one perfectly vertical. Now that curve is not perfectly lined up with the lens, but that's okay. We can come back and modify that in a little bit. I'll call that good for now. Let go of my mouse, then let go of the keyboard. Then I'm going to follow this curve of the lens all the way down, 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 until it stops moving down at that lowest point. Right about there it looks like is the lowest point before it starts curving back up. So I'll click, drag, and hold Shift, and pull that curve out to fit that lens nicely. That's actually fitting really closely to the frame. Then I will continue over to here until it goes furthest out to the left, somewhere right about there. Click, hold Shift, drag, and that one's probably going to need a little bit more work, but something like that looks pretty good. And then finally I'll come back to the original anchor point, click, drag while holding Shift, and just kind of tighten that curve up in the top left corner. So there we go. Just with these 4 points, I'm able to make a shape that very closely matches the curvature of this lens. And again, if I press Command Y to go to my outline view, we see this very nice curvy looking path made up of just 4 points. The same 4 points that can make up a rectangle or a circle, but I'm using these 4 points with these handles to make the lens shape. Now, I want to zoom in here nice and close. Now that I've drawn my main paths, I've set those points and got them in the right place, and I want to modify the handles a little bit more. Just taking a look at this a little bit closer, I can see that right about here, this path isn't filling in that frame as much as I'd like, and then maybe right here it's cutting into the frame a little bit too much, but otherwise it looks pretty good. To adjust these paths, I'm going to want to maybe change the position of some of the anchor points and then adjust the distance of each handle off of those anchor points to modify those curves. But I'm going to try to keep all of these handles perfectly horizontal or vertical as best as I can. So my first attempt is just going to kind of be looking at the placement of these points, maybe repositioning them a little bit, trying to find those extremes, just looking at it a little bit more closely. Looks like right about there is actually the widest point, so I'll put it right there. and then I'll just modify these handles. I'm holding down Shift to keep those handles from going left or right. That looks pretty good. I'm not quite hitting that frame, but I'll leave it as it is for now. And then down here it's cutting into the frame a little bit, so I'll bring this part up. That actually matches pretty well. Maybe I'll pull this one out a little bit. This is really kind of a push and pull process, getting these paths to fit the curves of the lens as closely as possible. I think that curve looks great. Right in here it's cutting into the frame a little bit, and I'm not sure that I'll be able to fix that just with the handles. I could try to maybe pull this one out a little bit more, pull this one up, but then I'm getting a little bit extreme, and now I'm cutting in over here. And this is where I want to point something out. I've actually pulled this handle so far out, it's going past where the next anchor point is. And when you do that, if I really exaggerate this, you'll notice that my curve is now going out to the left before curving into the right. So I want to make sure that I'm not pulling that handle past the anchor point so that the curve doesn't go beyond that anchor point, the next anchor point on the left side. So I'll just bring this back in, maybe pull this one down again. And I think I'm going to have to work on the placement of this anchor point a little bit, because the only option that I have right now really to get this to fit perfectly to the frame and the lens is to adjust the handle angle. You see, if I pull this one in a little bit, I can get that path to really hug the frame of the glasses there. But now that's not a perfectly vertical handle, and I know for a fact that I can make this shape with perfectly vertical and horizontal handles, and I'll tell you why. It's because this shape only has 4 extremes. Again, what I mean by that is there is a highest point, a lowest point, a most right point, and a furthest left point. Those 4 points on the lens are the furthest out in every direction. There are no, dips going up and down like a curve up here. The highest point, there is only one high point, and then it starts coming down again. It doesn't go up and then down and then back up. It's just up. It starts to go down, and then this is as far to the right as it goes. It starts curving in. This is as far low as it goes. It starts curving up, and that's as far to the left as it goes. Because I can see that visually, I know that I can reproduce that shape with 4 points with perfectly horizontal and vertical handles. So, like I said, I need to reposition my anchor point rather than adjusting these handles. So I'm going to undo and then just move this out of the way for a second and kind of look with my eye where the widest point was. I was putting the anchor point right about here, but if I zoom in nice and close, you can see that it looks like here is actually where the widest point to the left is. So I'm going to grab that with my direct selection tool and drag it right there. And already it's fitting better, but now I can just adjust these handles a little bit more, and I should be able to fit this in there perfectly just with these perfectly horizontal and vertical handles. Again, it's just a little bit of work pushing and pulling, and maybe just moving these anchor points up and down a little bit, making sure that they're aligned right where they need to be. This one might even go up just a tad further, and that fits a whole lot closer to the contour of the frame there. Then I'll come over to this one and take a look at it. This one is actually really close, but I think I can fit it in even a little bit tighter. Put it right about there, looks like the widest point. And reposition these handles again. And one thing to keep in mind is that unless the client that you're working for is absolutely requesting that this be perfect, you don't necessarily have to be 100% perfect. As long as it looks the way that you want it to, then that's fine. Don't worry too much about making this perfect. I'm probably spending more time than I need to on this, but I'm just trying to show you how you really can make just 4 points fit this type of shape pretty perfectly. I think that's about as close as I'm going to get. I'll switch to my outline view, and there you go. That looks so close to the original lens. And I was really far zoomed in there, so I know that it's pretty precise, and I think that I'm going to be able to call that good and move on to the frames. So I'm going to do kind of the same process, but I'm going to start right here in the middle, because again, I'm going to just do half of the frames and then flip it, mirror it, and join those 2 halves together once it's drawn. So I'll switch to my pen tool, P on the keyboard, Find the general middle of this part of the frame right about here. Click, hold shift, and drag out to the left. Now I'm not sure how far out I need to drag it, but maybe I'll do about that far. And then I want to find the extreme high point of the frame, which looks to me like it's right about there. I'll click, hold shift, and drag, and that actually worked fairly well. Now, when you're starting out, you're likely not going to get that lucky with your handles, but you can see that I kind of just estimated that for this curve right here, I need to pull the handle out about that far, and then on that second point, I was able to test my original estimate to see how well I actually made that first curve, and it just happened to work out great for me on this run. But don't get discouraged if you're not that lucky on your first try. Next, I want to come up to the top left corner right about here. Now, I'm not going to include this part that's going on the side and the top of the actual part that goes behind your ears. I'm not going to worry about that. I just want the frames, the lenses, and maybe these little guys right here. So I'll click once on this point. And I know that this is rounded, but I'm actually just going to make it a point with no handles. Click once so that it's a straight point. And then I'll come down and click one more time right here. That way this edge is nice and flat. And now I've got a curve that is a little bit unique. It's not going to be something that I curve straight out to the right, and there isn't a wide extreme point here. It's continually moving in to the right. So I'm going to have to again use some handles that aren't perfectly horizontal or vertical. So I'm going to start by following this curve, and let me zoom in nice and close here. Take a look at this curve here. It looks like it's curving inwards, and then right about here is where it switches to being a pretty straight line from this point to about this point. So I just want to focus on this tiny curve here from this point to here. So I'm going to go to where about that curve ends, click, and then drag. And this time, instead of holding shift to snap it to a horizontal or vertical, I'm going to match the line, the angle of this part of the frame right here. Now I don't want to pull it out very far, but I'll use that as a guide to match that angle. And now with that pulled out that far, that curve matches the frame pretty well. Then from there I'm going to come down to where it starts to curve out again. So it's pretty straight until right about here. I'll click there, drag out, and again use the side of the frame right here as my guide for where I want the handles to be. That's how I'm knowing what angle this handle should be at, because I want the line between these 2 points to be fairly straight. So if the handle is aligned with that path, then it should be a fairly straight line. Alright, now that I have that, I'm going to continue this line out. By the way, I deselected my path in the middle of drawing it, and that kind of disconnects your pen tool from the path. So if I were to switch to the pen tool and then click down here, it's going to add a new path, and that's not what I want. To continue the path, I have to select my pen tool, click and drag to add that initial handle, and then I can continue drawing that path. So I'll zoom out here and shift over, holding the space bar. Again, the hand tool temporarily switches to that tool. And I want to find the low point of these frames. So somewhere around here, hold down shift and drag that one out, maybe about there. And then I think I can finish this one off just by coming up to here. And it'll need some more work on this handle, but I think I can finish it off with just one more point. Now this is a case where I do want to use smart guides to align to this point. I want to make sure that my next anchor point is at the exact same horizontal position on my canvas. So I'm going to press Command or Control U to enable that. And there you go. I've got my pink smart guide showing up, letting me know this is going to be in the exact same horizontal position. So I'll click, hold shift, and drag out to the right. So somewhere around there is my guess for how far I'll need to pull that influence handle out. And then I'm going to switch over to my direct selection tool and pull this out even further while holding shift to kind of match the shape of that frame. And I'll just kind of again push and pull this curve until it matches. I think that actually looks really close to the original. Right here could use a little bit of work. I think I need to pull this handle down a little bit more. Again, I'm using this path right here as a guide. I'm trying to keep this handle right on top of that path. so that this edge stays nice and straight, but then curves off from this anchor point very nicely. And then I'll just pull this handle in a little bit. Maybe shift the point over a little bit even. And now that path fits very nicely with the frame. This one could be pulled in just a tad, and I think that's good. I'll switch to my outline mode. And there we go. I've got half of my sunglasses with the frame and the lens looking very nice and clean. Now I again made this same rookie mistake of not saving yet, so I'm going to press Command S to save and just name this sunglasses. Put it on my desktop, save, click OK, and now my document is saved, ready to go. Alright, now one thing that I want to point out is that this top left corner of the actual photo was pretty rounded, but I have this hard point on this anchor point right here. This is a great use case for the round corners tool. So if you remember, I'll just select that anchor point and then click and drag on this to round off the corner. I can make it as round as I want. That's way too extreme. I think I just want to round it off just a tiny little bit like that. And then same thing for this. It would never be such a harsh angle, so I'm just going to round it off a tiny little bit. And that way I get rid of that little hard corner and everything looks nice and curvy, very smooth. Alright, the last piece I want to draw is this little oval shape right here. To do this, I'm going to again switch to my pen tool, and I can actually do this with just 2 points. So I'm going to start by disabling my Smart Guides, and then click right here on the left extreme, hold down Shift while dragging, and I want to make these handles come out the same distance as the extremes of the height of that shape. So holding Shift, I'm just kind of eyeballing it. I think right about there is how far the top and bottom of that shape will go. Then I'll come over to the opposite side, click, hold Shift and drag, let go, and then close off this point by going to the original point, clicking, holding Shift and dragging that out one more time. Alright, so that's pretty close, but as you can see, it's not perfect. This is where I need to modify the handles independently of each other. So with the pen tool selected, I'll just hold down Option, and then start adjusting these paths. So I'm going to bring these top ones in a little bit so that it's a little bit more of a narrow arc. And then I'll do the same thing for this one. I'm holding down Command to switch to my Direct Selection tool, select this path so I can see these handles, and then modify these handles so that the curvature matches the actual shape. There we go. That's kind of more of a football shape and more closely resembles that actual shape. Now the corners, or these points rather, are actually rounded just like these points here, so I'll undo, Command Z, and then I will round off these 2 points just a little bit, both at the same time. So I selected both of them, and then I'll click and round them off just a tiny little bit there. Outline mode to see that. That looks great. Alright, now that I have those 3 shapes completed, I just need to mirror them and join the frame at the middle. Now, there are a handful of ways that you can mirror things inside of Illustrator. The one that we're going to focus on right now is through the transform controls. So I'm going to select all of my paths with my selection tool, just drag a box around all of them, and then I'm going to come up to Object, then down to Transform, and this is where we can see our transform controls. The one that I'm concerned with right now is the Reflect Transform. So I'll click on that, which brings up this little dialog box. And all of the transform controls kind of have a similar layout with this pop-up window. And there are some controls for us, but the first thing I want to point out is this little preview checkbox. If you don't have that checked, you're not going to see what these transformations are going to do, so I almost always just turn that on first. And now you can see that my path has gone ahead and flipped. It's reflected or mirrored itself, and it's doing that on the vertical axis. So that's what my controls up here are for. I can flip it on the vertical axis, or I could flip it on the horizontal axis, and now it's flipping it like this instead of like this. I can also do a custom angle. Now, I've never honestly used this. I don't know why you would want it to be at any angle other than perfectly horizontal or vertical, but be aware it is there if you ever run into an issue where that is a good thing for you to have an option for. But I want it to be transformed on the vertical. Now I'll click OK, and my paths are flipped. But if I press Command Y to show my outlines, I've lost my original copy. So I could have copied and pasted in place and then transformed, but there's actually a simpler way. So I'll make that selection again, go back into Object, Transform, Reflect, and there's one last control that I kind of glossed over at first, which is this button right here. And I clicked on OK, which just modified what I had selected, but I can instead click on Copy, which will duplicate that object and apply the transformation to it. Now that I have both copies on top of each other, I need to make sure that I select the right paths to move over. So I'll select this frame right here, this shape, and the actual frame of the glasses. And that was just using the selection tool and holding down Shift while clicking on each object. Now I'll turn on my Smart Guides, Command U, so that I can make sure that I'm grabbing these paths from this point right here. This is the point that will go right in the middle of the frames. I want to grab that and move it over here. And I'll just move it out of the way for a second so we can see. I'll turn my outline mode back on. What I want is for this to line up with this. But I want to make sure that I'm moving all of the objects at once. So I'll drag my selection around all three objects again, grab that anchor point, and then move it to that anchor point. And right there I got that white hollow arrow tool, and that's letting me know that it's lining up with that anchor point. Now I know that is perfectly symmetrical, 100%, and I can now join the two halves of these frames. So I'm going to use my direct selection tool and draw a box around both of those points at once, and then press Command J to join them. And then I'll zoom in nice and close down here at the bottom so we can see that these 2 points actually did not line up perfectly. But I don't want to just grab this one and move it over to here, because then this path is going to be slightly different than this one, and I want it to be perfectly symmetrical. So I'm going to drag a box around those points with my direct selection tool one more time, and instead of pressing Command J, I want to come up to Object, Path, Average, which is Option Command J or Alt Control J on a PC. What this is going to do is bring up this window and allow me to average the position of these points on the horizontal axis, the vertical axis, or both axes. So I'm going to leave it at both and click OK, and that brought the two paths together, the two anchor points. So they're right on top of each other now, and with them selected, I can then press Command J, and they're joined together. And just in case that was a little confusing, let me just draw another custom shape real quick. I've got a path. I'll click a point here, 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 here. It doesn't really matter what this shape is. But let's say that I want these 2 points to be in the exact same spot. Well, if I select them both and come up to Object, Path, Average, then I choose just on the vertical axis and click OK, see that that brought both of those points together on the vertical axis only. If I undo, go up to Object, Path, Average, and then change this to horizontal and click OK, then it's just going to horizontally align those 2 points, averaging the distance between them. But if I do it on both axes, I'll press Command Option J to bring that up and make sure that both is selected, then it's just going to bring all of those points together. And I could do this with any number of points. I could select this point here, this one here, and this one, Option Command J, both axes, click OK, and now all of those points are right on top of each other. So in the case of the sunglasses, that was a very small amount of movement. It did not take much to get those lined up, but that was important to do before I joined them, or else it would have added another path between those 2 points. As long as they're directly on top of each other, there won't be any extra paths in between those anchor points. Alright, let's take a look at this. Now, on the left side, it looks pretty great. On the right side, it's not lining up so much. Now, this is more than likely just a photography issue. If you look at the left side of the sunglasses, you can see a little bit of that part that goes back to your ear. And on the right side, you don't see nearly as much of it. So the camera was probably just slightly off angle to the left from where the sunglasses actually were. So it wasn't a perfectly symmetrical photo, but that is an extremely difficult thing to do in the real world. So I'm totally fine with it not lining up 100% on the right side. But now let's start filling it in. So I want to make the frames black. I'll select that, swap my fill and stroke, and make that just black. And then that's covering up all of my other paths. So let me open up this layer, find it, and I'll rename this frames, and then drag it down to the bottom of the list. Then I'll grab these two paths and swap my fill and stroke, and those are my lenses. So I'll call this one the right lens, or just R lens for short. This one L lens for short. And then we have these two little buttons. I'll just call them buttons. I'll bring this one up to the top and call this R button, and this one L button. And then I'll select both of those and swap the fill and stroke as well. Now I can turn off my photo reference and maybe change the color of the lenses and the buttons to be white instead of this yellow color. And there you go. I have a very clean, perfectly symmetrical illustration of these sunglasses, and I can have fun with them now. First, I want to make sure that they're perfectly centered, so I'll select everything by targeting the entire layer, then go to my properties and center this up. So remember, 960 on the x-axis is half of 1920, so that's the center point of the vertical axis, and then 540 on the y-axis will get us centered up nice and horizontally. That's half of 1080. Let's add some colors to this document. So first of all, let's put in a background. I'll grab my rectangle tool, click and drag to make it the size of the document using my smart guides, and then reposition that at the bottom of the document. Now it's just white right now, but let's make it this like maybe crazy orangey peachy color. That looks pretty nice. I like that. I'll rename this BG, and then let's change the frames to like a nice red color. Maybe not pure red, but something around this area right here. And that's competing a little with the background, so maybe I'll just make that a little more pink in the background there. Something like that. And the frames are a little intense, so I'll maybe back down on the brightness and saturation just a little bit. Yeah, it's still a little too intense. I think maybe somewhere around here might work a little bit better. That's a little softer. I like the way that that blends in with the background too. Maybe just shift that a little more orange. There we go. I like that. Alright, now we need to change these lenses because the lenses would never be white, so let's select both of those, and I could make them black. That's definitely an option, but that's very, very black. It's 100% black, so maybe it should match the background a little bit more. So I'm going to actually use the eyedropper tool to select that color as a start. Now it looks like I just have frames. But then I'll select those again and make them a little bit darker. So I'll bring them down maybe somewhere around here, introduce some more saturation, and click OK. And now they almost look a little bit semi-transparent. But what if I wanted them to look almost reflective? Well, I could, instead of making them darker, actually make them a lighter version of this color. So I'll press I to bring up my eyedropper tool. With them selected, I'll click on that background, and then maybe just use my little color sliders right here and introduce a little bit more yellow, make it a little bit lighter. And now it almost looks a little bit like it's a reflection of maybe the environment. Last up are these little buttons. I'll just select them, and I'll do the same thing. I'll make those reflective, and I think those colors are working fairly nice together. Up until now, we've only dealt with solid fills and solid strokes, but I want to point out another way that you can actually fill in an area of paths, and that's by using gradients. Now, gradient is a series of colors, and I'll show you what I mean by that. If I take a rectangle, and I'll just make it off to the side here. Right now we just have a solid fill, one color. But if I come down to this little button right here, that's the gradient button, I'll click on it. And now I don't just have one color, I have a whole bunch of colors going from white to black. So I've got this little gradient panel that popped up when I did that, and there are lots of controls again. Gradients can be very complex, and I'll just say this now, it is very difficult to use gradients effectively. It's taken me years to even wrap my head around how to use them in a way that doesn't look very cheesy. It's not that hard to use gradients in a way that just does not look very high quality. So I would use them sparingly, especially at this state in your education in design. But I still want to show you how they work and how we can apply them to these sunglasses. So right now it's a gradient going from white to black from left to right. But with it selected, if I come down to the gradient panel, you see that same gradient going from white to black down here. These little squares down at the bottom are what control what colors are in your gradient. And as I clicked on that, you saw that the color panel has also shifted over to being the same color as what I have selected. Let's say that I want to change the color of this white side so it's not actually white anymore. Well, with that selected, I'll come over to my color panel and take a look. Now, I don't see any other colors. It's just white and black and grays in between. Why is this? Well, it's because there are different ways of handling colors inside of Illustrator, and this is a little bit confusing, but right now I'm only looking at grayscale colors, and that means no real color information. It's just brightness or value from black to white. So I could make this darker by moving the slider around or clicking around down here, but that's not really what I want. Let's say I want to make it like a light yellow color. Well, what I need to do is come over to this little menu right here and click on it. And right there you can see that I'm on grayscale. Now, there are lots of options here, but don't concern yourself with anything except RGB, and that stands for red, green, blue. And RGB is the color mode that we will be working in with all of our graphics. So if you're ever seeing things that look differently than you're expecting, if anything ever says anything other than RGB, just make sure you come to this menu and click on RGB. Now I can introduce colors like this blue or maybe a light green or pale yellow, and there we go. Now my gradient is going from this color to the black. Now that I click on that black though, I again lose my RGB values, so I need to switch this from grayscale to RGB, and then maybe introduce a more saturated green, a little bit more yellow, a little bit of blue, and there we go. Now we've got a gradient going from a paler color to a more saturated color. But what if I didn't want it to go from left to right? Well, if I have it selected, I can also use this little angle on the gradient panel to choose what direction I want that to be moving in. So right now it's at 0, but if I were to type in 45, now it's coming from the bottom left corner and going up to the top right. I'm going to make these colors a little bit more different so it's easier to see what's going on. There we go. There we go. Now you can see very clearly bottom left is this color, top right is this color. If I change this angle to, say, 90, then it's going to go from the top down or the bottom up. You can also control how much of each part of the gradient is being displayed. Right now, this color is at the bottom, very bottom of this square, and this color is the very top. But if I were to grab this color and drag it over to the left, you can see this location number is changing. And now I'm getting more of that red color on the top portion of my square. It's getting to a certain point where it hits that color, and then everything after that point is the same color. I could grab this other color and move it in as well. I'll put this one back to the left and this one all the way to the right, and then take a look at this type right here. Now, linear is the current type, and that's saying that it's going from one side to the other, or top down. It's in a linear path from point A to point B. But if I change this from linear to radial, now I've got a round gradient going from the center outwards. So right now this color is on the center, this color is on the outer edge, but let's say I want to swap those. All I have to do is drag this one over here, drag this one over here, and then they swap. Again, moving these around will adjust how your gradient looks. But another thing about gradients is that you can have more than just two colors. If I were to click anywhere in here, you see that I have this little plus icon next to my pointer. If I click right here, I get another color. Now this is exactly the same color as this red right here, so you don't really see any difference. But if I were to change that color to be like a nice bright blue, now I've got three colors blending into each other. Now, this is where things can get really ugly really fast. These colors don't look good together at all, which is why it's so important that you're careful and you use gradients very sparingly, especially, again, at this point. When used effectively, they can be great at applying things like shading to flat graphics, and that's actually exactly what I want to do to my sunglasses over here. So with a little bit of those controls out of the way, I'm going to delete this ugly tie-dye looking gradient, and I want to add gradients to these lenses. So with one selected, I'm going to click on this gradient, and you can see that those same colors are still there. So when I click it, it's going to apply that gradient. That is not what I want at all. So I'm going to select this little drop-down arrow and go back up to the white black default. And there we go. I've got my linear black and white gradient back exactly the way that I had it originally. What I want to do is make these lenses look like they're tinted but fade out near the bottom. You know, some sunglasses do that where they're darker at the top and they slowly get less dark towards the bottom. So I want to change the angle of this so that it's rotated 90 degrees. So now the dark part is at the top, the white part is at the bottom, and then I'll bring the black in a little bit so that the gradient starts out very solid and then gradually fades into the lighter color. So this is looking okay, but I want it to be based on this same color that I had already picked. So I can actually use the eyedropper in conjunction with gradients. To do that, I'm going to make sure I have the color selected that I want to adjust. So not the white, but the black. Then I'll press I on the keyboard to get my eyedropper tool. And instead of just clicking, I will hold down Shift to sample just that color and click. And now that little color square, that sample, has that same color in it. So it's going to be a gradient coming from that color to a lighter color. Now looking at it now, that actually might be a better color for the lighter portion at the bottom. So I'm going to click on this little button right here, which is the reverse gradient button. And that's going to just swap these two colors. So I'll click it. And there we go. Now it's not only swapped the colors, but it's also swapped the position. So I'm going to need to move this one over and then pull this one down a little bit. And now I want to change the color of this white to something darker. So I could do the same color, but actually no, let's just let's do the background color. That's conveniently darker, so I'm going to click on that, press I to go to my eyedropper, and then hold Shift so that I'm just sampling the color. I'm not converting the gradient, and click on the background. And that looks pretty good. I like kind of the way that fades in. It almost looks like it's transparent there, but now that I see it, that's actually the opposite of what would actually happen. If this was tinted more on the top and not at the bottom, then the top portion is what you're not going to see through, and you'd see that background color on the bottom. So I need to reverse my gradient again. I'll click on that, make sure I have my actual object with the gradient selected, click on the reverse gradient button, and then shift these over one more time. So right about there looks pretty good. Now I just want to make this color just slightly different so it stands out a little bit more from the rest of my scene. So I'm going to bring this one down a little bit, and then maybe this one up just a little, and there we go. Now it's a little more golden. I think that stands out better, and I like the way it looks. Now another little feature of the gradient palette that's nice is this little diamond shape right here. It's called the gradient slider, and what this lets you do is kind of control how the two colors blend together. So if I click and drag it to the left, you see that now I have more of this yellowy color showing up, and then it fades more gradually from that color into the darker orangey peach color. And if I drag it the opposite direction, then we're going to get a little bit more of that peachy color. It's kind of just compressing that gradient without moving these two color pickers that we have for our actual source colors. And it's just a way to be able to modify the gradient a little bit. So maybe I'll pull that up just a tad. And this is the location. It's saying it's 53% between those two colors. So if you wanted it right in the middle, you could just reset that back down to 50. I think I'm going to pull it a little bit towards that brighter side, so maybe around 60. That looks pretty good. And one more thing that's really great to know about gradients is that there's actually a gradient tool. So if we come over to our tools palette and look right here, you see that same icon of going from white to black. That's our gradient tool, and G is the keyboard shortcut. So I'm going to click on that, and because I had my object that already had a gradient on it selected, I get this little overlay graphic showing up on top of it. And this is kind of like an interactive overlay version of the gradient palette right on top of the actual object with the gradient. So it's showing me, when I highlight over it, my little color pickers right here, so the light color and the dark color. And I can click and drag these just like I did in the gradient panel, and you can see it's updating there too. But that controls where those two colors are and how they're blending. I could also grab this part of the gradient slider, just like this little diamond shape here, and control that. I'm going to undo. But you can also kind of click and drag a gradient with this tool. So if I just move my mouse off of the overlay over here, you see I have this crosshair icon for my mouse. If I start in the top left and click and drag, I get this overlay, and I can kind of do this at any angle, but if I go down to the bottom right and let go, it applies the gradient that I have loaded up in my gradient palette, but at that specific angle. And once it's applied, I can even come down to here and hover over right at the end of this line. You see that I have this rotation, this round circle with an arrow at the end. That icon, if I click and drag, lets me rotate the gradient. So I can control very freely the direction of that gradient, and if I click and drag on the overlay as a whole, I can reposition it. So if I want less of that peachy color showing up at the top, I can do that. If I want to redraw my gradient, I can do that. This is kind of a more interactive way to be able to adjust gradients, and definitely worth knowing about. Now I want this to go back to the way that I had it, so I'm just going to click on this bottom point, hold shift so that it's perfectly vertical, and go to the top and let go. Now my gradient's back to the way that I had it, and I can apply it to the other lens. Now I can transfer this over very easily with the eyedropper tool. So with the lens selected, I'll just press I on the keyboard for the eyedropper, click once on that other lens, and that brings over the appearance with the gradient applied exactly in the same way. Lastly, I just want to select both of these little buttons, switch to my eyedropper tool, and hold down Shift so that I'm just sampling this part of the gradient and fill it with that color. And now my color palette is more unified and everything is working together very well. So that's how you can use the pen tool to make custom paths based on a photo reference and then add some nice little styling to those graphics using gradients. Now I want to move away from the photo reference and use a sketch that I made instead to show you how you can make vector graphics still preserve a kind of organic, hand-done quality that you get when you're doing things with your actual hands, something like pencil to paper. So let's do that next. I'm going to make a new document, and again the web large 1920 by 1080 preset will work fine. And I want to bring in a sketch that I made. So I'm going to go up to File, Place, and I just took a picture of my sketchbook. Here we go. I've got this little bear that I drew, and I'll just place that in my document. And this is going to be really big, so I'm going to scale it down, holding Option and Shift while scaling that to scale it from the center. Then I'll just line it up in the center of my document, maybe make it a little bit bigger. I'll go ahead and rename that layer Sketch Ref and lock it, and then make a new layer. And the first thing I want to point out about my sketch is that it is clearly done by hand. It is not perfectly symmetrical. This ear is a little bit flopped down, this one's more perked up, this arm is a little bit wider than this arm, and this part of the arm is curved one direction, and this part of the arm is curved in the opposite direction. So I want to kind of preserve that organic, more hand-done look of my original sketch while still making it a nice, clean-looking vector graphic. But we can still do that using the pen tool. So the process is going to be very similar, and I'm still going to follow those same rules of using as few points as I possibly can in my anchor points, as well as keeping the handles of those anchor points horizontal or vertical as much as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and start tracing this. And before I actually add any points, I kind of want to just take a look at the sketch as a whole and think about how I might make it. Because the body of the bear is kind of divided right here because of the overlapping arms. But if you look very faintly, you can see these lines that I originally drew right in here that are kind of outlining the body of the bear before I drew the arms on top. Now I could, trace these lines exactly. Maybe start here, go down the arm, come up all the way around, and then end right here. But then I'd have the top half of the bear, and I'd have to draw the bottom half, and there'd be this weird gap in between the two pieces. Instead, I kind of want to construct this in a way that just makes a little bit more sense. I'm going to do the entire body as a whole. The head, this part of the body, all the way down to the hips, to the feet, and then connect all of this so it's all one piece, and then draw the arms on top of it so that I can have this end and it'll be an open path and it'll all work a little bit better together. Now, if you're not following all of that, that's fine. I'm going to do it for you right now and it'll all make sense. Now, some of these spots I am going to want to make a little bit more symmetrical than I drew them. Like the head, for instance, is a little bit lopsided, so I might want to adjust that. But I'm just going to go ahead and start at the top middle and work my way counterclockwise around the entire drawing. So with my pen tool selected, P on the keyboard, I'm going to make sure I have a stroke, and I'll just make the stroke a nice bright, like magenta-y, pinky color. That way I can just see it nice and clear. Actually, let's make it like a cyan. There we go. That'll be easy to see on top of this drawing. And I'm going to turn off my Smart Guides, Command U, and then I'll start right about here in the middle, top of the head. Click and drag while holding Shift. Alright, so that's the highest point of the head. Now I'm looking for the widest point of the head, which is right about here. So I'll click, hold Shift, and drag. And this is a good opportunity to point something out. Knowing how far out to pull your handles is actually something you can make a pretty good guess at. I pulled this one out way further than I needed to, so this curve is really coming off of my original sketch a lot more than it should have. Let me show you how a circle works. If I just bring out an ellipse and draw it, this is what these handles look like. You'll notice that all the handles are perfectly symmetrical, and they come out about halfway up the curve. So halfway on the vertical axis between this point and this point. That's where that handle is landing. And the same thing for the vertical or horizontal axis rather. This handle is coming about halfway between this anchor point and this anchor point. If I were to pull this out further and this one up further, then I'm going to get a lopsided section of this circle, and that's not going to work out. So instead of doing this, I'm going to just start over again and kind of estimate this a little bit better. I'm going to click and drag about halfway to this point. Not as far out as I was going before, but about halfway to where that next anchor point is going to land. And then I'll click, hold Shift, and drag up. And now that fits a little bit better. Now, like I said, my sketch was not perfect. For the head, I think I'm going to leave it as is. I don't really want the head to be very lopsided. So for now, I'm just going to call that curve good, and I'm going to continue on with my drawing. And at this point, I'm going to kind of deviate from my original sketch. I don't want to come down to the outside of the arm because, like I said, I'm going to do that in a separate object. Instead, I'm kind of just going to look at my original sketch and come down to right about here. It looks like the middle section of his torso, like the outside of his belly, would be his widest point right around here. So I'm just going to click, hold Shift, and drag. And this is really kind of up to me where I want this to be. I definitely want to pull this influence handle down a little bit, this Bezier. So I'm going to drag that down so it matches the contour of the neck there a little bit better. And then just take a look at kind of those faint lines of my original sketch. I think that's following it pretty closely. So I'm going to call that good and continue on. Now this is the line that I'm concerned with, so I want to make sure that I'm lining it up nicely with that. And this is one of those scenarios where I'm probably going to have to add in an anchor point somewhere in here to match my original sketch a little bit more closely. Because if I come down to here and make something that's just perfectly vertical like this, it's not going to follow the contour exactly the way that I want, and then I'm going to have a little bit of trouble down here with the feet, getting them to look exactly the way that I want. So let me undo this and maybe add an extra path right in here. I don't need to pull out the handles too far, but something about there looks good. And then I'll pull this handle up so that that curve is nice and flowy. Again, I'm going to press Command Y to see that curve. That looks nice and smooth, so I'm happy with the way that looks. And I just want to continue this path down to probably right about here. Click and drag. And then I'll do one for the middle of the foot. One right about here. Again, I'm lining up these handles with kind of the angle of the brush stroke of my original sketch. There we go. And then I'll finish it off right here at the underside of his belly. So that looks pretty good. Let's look at the outline mode and zoom in here a little bit closer. Now there is a little bit of an issue with this section right here. I think this handle needs to line up a little bit more nicely with this line, so it's a much more smooth transition between those two. I think that looks a little bit better. And then maybe this one needs to curve in just a little bit more. Maybe this one can come out a bit. There we go. That curve looks nice and smooth, but it still kind of mimics that original sketch that I had. Maybe this handle could be pulled down a little bit. Yeah, I like the way that that looks. Alright, so the first half of my bear is done. Now I want to continue this path, but I want to get rid of this handle. So I'm just going to click once on the anchor point, and that way it'll get rid of that handle. I'll hold Shift to come straight over to here, and then click. And now, if I hold down Option, I can pull out a Bezier handle here, and I'll continue my drawing. So I'm just going to add a point here, and now I'm doing this a little bit more freely, not worried too much about the horizontal and vertical paths, because my sketch is pretty rough, and I want to kind of preserve that, especially on this side of the bear. So from here, I want to come up to, it looks like right around here. The line is coming out to here, so probably right about here would be the widest point. I'm kind of looking at this anchor point, and just kind of eyeballing about where that would be. Click, hold Shift, and really stretch that out. And then I'll have to bring this handle up as well to match the curvature of that leg. There we go. That works out pretty nicely. And then I'm going to just follow this up to right about the side of his head. Again, the same height as this other anchor point. And I'll add another handle. There we go. Pushing and pulling these handles until it matches the curve of my sketch. That looks pretty good. And I'll switch to outline mode to see. That looks pretty good. Now I just need to connect this path to this one right here. There we go. I think that looks great. Now this is a little bit lopsided up here on the head. You can see that it's much more of a flat arc over here than it is on this side. But that might be okay. Maybe it'll actually add a little bit of charm to this vector graphic and make it seem like it's a little bit more hand done. So maybe I'll just modify this path actually and have it fit that sketch a little bit more. I can always come back to this after I finish and adjust it a little bit more. But I think this is going to work out just fine. Alright, so I have the main body portion of my bear drawn out in paths. Now I'm going to do the arms, and the way that I'm going to do this is by starting with the same anchor point as what I already had right here. And to make sure that I line up with that, I'll deselect it, enable my Smart Guides, Command U, and then highlight over this path until I find that anchor point. So it looks like right here is the anchor, so I'm going to click. Because I didn't have it selected, I'm making a new path. Then I'll hold down Shift and draw this down. And what I'm doing now is just tracing this arm instead of the body, but I'm keeping the original anchor point on that same exact spot as the head so that this will line up very seamlessly once I go and add fills to it. So there we go. I've pulled my first one down. I'll come to the widest point of the arm right about here. Click, hold Shift, and drag. And then fit this curve a little bit more nicely to the original sketch. There we go. And I could add another path right here. You know, maybe pull this handle up, add one right here, and pull it out. But I think I can get away with just 2 points if I go straight to here. Click, make that nice and vertical, and then just adjust these handles a little bit to fit it to that mitt of his hand. There we go. That looks great. Alright, now I need to pull this handle down, but if I do it with my direct selection tool, that's going to just swap the handles. So I need to break that relationship, holding Option or Alt to switch to the anchor point tool. Hold down Shift and pull it down just a little bit less than the other handle. And then I'll probably come all the way up to where this ends. And I don't think holding Shift is going to work out for this one. I'm going to want this to end at an angle and kind of just fit this again to my original sketch. Something like this. Looks like it's going to work out. See how that outline mode looks. Great. I think that's a good left arm. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the right arm. So I'm going to find that anchor point right here up at the top. Click, hold Shift and drag, and then come down to the widest point of the wrist here and just fit this to the original sketch. Alright, I think that looks pretty good. pull this handle up a little bit. And then break this relationship. And then this one is probably going to be needing another anchor point because I want this handle to curve at this angle, but I'm going to need something down here. So I'm actually going to end that path right where it is. I'll hit escape to apply it, and then I'm going to add another point anywhere on this path and move it around. So I'm going to fit this to that sketch right where I want it to live, and then modify the handles. Alright, that's looking pretty good. Let's see the outline mode. Very nice. Alright, now I need to make this little line for the underside of his belly, so I'm just going to click and drag a little bit, and then click and drag a little bit. And I want this line to kind of come down below the line that's connecting the two legs. So I'm just going to kind of cheat this a little bit, maybe even pull these ones up. That way you can keep the position of the original line. And you'll see why I'm doing that in just a minute. There we go. And then we're going to need to come up to the head and do the ears and the face. So let's start with the ears. I'm just going to start with a point right about here. Click and drag, and I'm kind of thinking this would be where the base of the circle would be. And I'm going to try and do this with 4 points. So just like making a circle, I'll add a path right about here with some handles. Do one at the midpoint, at the top. One right here, and then finally closing off the path. Now I'm doing this extremely freehand, so it's not going to be very precise, but as long as I can, manipulate these handles enough to produce decent looking curves, then everything is going to work out just fine, and I'll be able to preserve some of that organic analog look that I have from my original sketch. There we go. I like the shape of that ear. I'll do the same thing over here. I'll start at the bottom. Put one on the side, one right about the top. And again, you can hold down space bar while you're still drawing your paths to reposition the anchor point. Do another one right about here, and then finish it off. There we go. And now I'll just modify these handles a little bit. Make sure these curves are nice and smooth. And I think that's great. This portion of the ear is just going to get overlapped by the bear, so I'm not worried about it. Now I need to make the nose, so I'm going to try and do this by just drawing a circle at first and then manipulating it. So I'll make a perfect circle, line it up with the base of the nose there, and then I'm going to switch to my direct selection tool and grab that top anchor point and pull it down. And then I want to bring up the handles on either side and maybe bring this point down even a little bit further. And this is a case where I want to bring these handles further beyond where this original anchor point is going so that I kind of get this up and down movement. I think I'll rotate these handles a little bit. And I'm going to turn off my smart guides just so it's a little bit easier to work with. And then maybe I'll take my anchor point tool, which is Shift-C, and then redo these handles a little bit so they don't influence that curve quite as much. There we go. So we kind of almost have this little heart shape going. I'll take my anchor point tool and make these handles even a little less influenced there so it has more of a heart shape. And then just adjust these a little bit more so they fit my original sketch. Alright, I think that's a pretty decent nose shape. And now I'm going to finish this off with the eyes. Now I could trace this, but I actually can make this very easily with a stroke, and I'll show you exactly how I do that. So I'm going to click and drag to kind of make that arc. And then I'm just going to make my stroke really big. Something like that. 10 points. And then I'll click on stroke and make sure that my cap is rounded. There we go. That's almost exactly the same shape as what I originally drew. I'll just reposition this a little bit to fit, and I think that's going to work out. I'll do the same thing over on this side. Draw my little arc, little macaroni shape, and there we go. Alright, now I have all the components of my bear, and I can start filling everything in. So I'm going to turn off my reference, and I'll fill the nose, the ears, with this same color. I'll just swap the fill and stroke, actually. There we go. And then I'm going to fill the arms with white. There we go. Now you can't see that overlapping shape. I'll make sure the bear is filled with white as well. And then I'm going to come down to this line right here, and even though it's only 2 points and it's an open path, I'm going to add a white fill to it, because that fill is going to cover up this portion of the line between the legs. So that way I can cover that up without having to do any extra work. And these 2 ears are not in the right place, so I need to open this up, and I'll just rename my paths very quickly. I've got my RI, my LI. Oop. I've got the nose. This is the left or right ear. Left ear. That is the belly line. The right arm, left arm, and the body. Alright, now I need to pull these ears down below the body, so that way they show up behind it. Very nice. And now I could pick some colors. So again, I should probably pick a background color. I'll put my Smart Guides on, Command U, and drag this out to be the size of the document. Drag that down and rename it background. I don't need a stroke, but I do need a color. Maybe just like an off-white, yellowy color. Something like that. Okay, and then I'll lock that so I don't accidentally mess with it. And then I need to pick some colors for the bear. So maybe the white portions, I'll just select all the objects that have a white fill. Could be maybe a reddish color. So let's see, I want to take down the blue and the green and make this more of red. In fact, I'm just going to switch over to my color picker. Sometimes I enjoy swapping the RGB values around, but sometimes it's a lot easier to just try and find the color that I'm thinking of right inside the color picker. So something like that, and then I'll change the blue lines to maybe just a black or a really dark color. Maybe I'll tint it red. Something like that. And then I'll change these shapes to be the same color. So I'll select those, press the eyedropper, and then shift-click on the stroke. And make sure that I'm on the fill, active on the fill. Shift-click the stroke. And then I'll grab the eyes and do the same thing. Make sure I'm on the stroke color and shift-click on that dark color. There we go. Those are kind of unusual colors, but they work. There you go. I've got my little bear that's now in vector form compared to my original sketch, which looked like this. So I've taken my original drawing and translated it into a vector graphic, and it's not perfectly symmetrical. Again, some of these handles were not perfectly horizontal or vertical. Let me change the color of my paths so it's a little bit easier for us to see. There we go. You can see that like some of these handles down at the bottom I took some liberties with, but that's okay. Sometimes you're going to run into situations where you don't want to have perfect handles on every single curve. This one right here, I'm actually noticing there is like this kind of slight little dent in the leg right there, and it's because of this handle. Now I could just try and finesse this a little bit and make it a little bit more smooth, or I could just try and get rid of it. So I'm going to switch to my pen tool and click and maybe just modify this to get something that was similar to my original sketch, but not exactly. But this way it does produce a much nicer looking curve than what I originally had. I think I like that better. So there you go, my original sketch next to my newly vectorized version of the sketch, which is ready to go. Maybe I'd want to make the stroke a little bit thicker. It's pretty thin right now. Maybe make it a 3 or a 4. And then I also want to round off those caps. You see that there's still just flat caps there, so I'm going to select all of these paths and round off the cap. But I also want to point out that right here, this is a join. That's what Illustrator calls a join. Also has a flat cap, but you can also round those off. If I select this all again and come to stroke, there's a corner. I can change that to a round join, and now those have the rounded off ends as well. So I don't have any sharp points on this, and it makes the entire design just feel a little bit more consistent, round, soft, like a big cuddly teddy bear. Alright, I realize that was a whole lot of information that I just threw at you, but you really have to have a good understanding of how the pen tool works if you're going to start making your own custom graphics and getting them to look the way that you want them to. Like I said at the beginning, you're going to be using this pen tool in all of the Adobe software that you're probably going to be using in the future, so you really need to get into Illustrator now and start practicing making curves. See how the pen tool works, get a feel for the tools that you have, and how to make these nice flowing curves with as few points as possible and as often as you can using perfectly horizontal or vertical handles. Alright, I'm going to leave you with that, and I'll catch you in the next lesson.